N. Erich Nettenbeck, born January 14th, 1926 in Cleve, and died of his wounds January 29th, 1945. He was an Obergrenadier and is buried in the Bad Neuenaur Military Cemetery. Johann New, born March 20th, 1922 in Groesbeck, and fell July 18th, 1943 in the East. He was a Gefreiter and died in a field hospital in Kremichka, Ukraine. Theodor Nielin, born May 26, 1891 in Cleve, and fell October 7, 1944 in an air raid. He is buried in the military cemetery in Cleve. Many of Theodor's co-workers were killed in this same raid, including Heinrich Brauers, Gerhard Clausen, Walter Clausen, Johann von der Essen, Theodor Gorsen, Fritz Konders, and Heinrich Linders. Alex Nicholson, born May 27, 1907 in Cleve, and died of his wounds on August 23, 1944. Heinrich Neumann, born December 23, 1920 in Cleve, and fell August 20, 1941. O. Heinrich Ackers, born January 7, 1906 in Matterborn, and fell September 2, 1942 in the East. Heinrich was an Oberschütze in the 2nd Company of Landschützenbataillon 915, part of the 202nd Sicherungsbrigade, Infantry Ersatz Regiment 609. He was killed by a headshot in Chesemiole, Belarus. A fellow factory worker, Theodor Arnst, also served in the battalion. He was an Obergefreiter in Company 3 and would die from an injury on January 24, 1943. Willy Oman, born March 24, 1923 in Kellen, and fell November 16, 1943 in the East. Willy was a Gefreiter in the 1st Company of Pioneer Battalion 106, part of the 106th Infantry Division. He was killed by a headshot in Uspenskoye, Ukraine, and is buried in the Kropivnitskaya Cemetery in Block 12, Unknown Soldiers Section. The battalion would later be destroyed in 1944. Another member of the company, Jacob Luck, also served in this division. He was a Gefreiter in the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 240, dying of a shrapnel wound in Smolensk on August 30th, 1941. I also have a death card for another member of the division, Hans Bachhaus. Hans was a Gefreiter in Company 5 of Infantry Regiment 241 and would die from a gunshot wound to the left hip in Lviv on April 25th, 1942. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. Galatians 2:19. Johann Orta, born September 27, 1921 in Elberfeld, and fell March 5, 1944. Wilhelm Otten, born August 11, 1908 in Kalkar, and fell August 20, 1942 in the East. Wilhelm was a Gefreiter and died in a field hospital in Zukovka near Kursk. He is most likely buried in the Kursk Cemetery with the unknown soldiers in Block 7. P. Paul Powell, born September 29, 1922 in Kellen, and fell January 14, 1945 in the East. Paul was a Gefreiter and was killed in Swiercze, Poland. Anton Peters, born August 1, 1915 in Cleve, and fell on July 22, 1941. Anton was an Unteroffizier in the 10th Company of Infantry Regiment 56th, part of the 5th Infantry Division. He was killed by a headshot in Ploskoye, near Smolensk. Heinrich Peters, born August 23, 1921 in Matterborn, and fell on July 5, 1942. Heinrich was a Schütze in the 10th Company of Infantry Regiment 428, part of the 129th Infantry Division. He was killed by an artillery shot to the head in Karpovo during the Battle of Rshev. He is buried in the military cemetery there, most likely in the Unknown Soldiers section, Block 2. According to eternal iron great laws, we all have to complete our circles of existence. Goethe. Heinrich Peters, born June 19, 1922 in Cleve, and fell January 10, 1943 in the East. Heinrich was a grenadier in the 3rd Company of Grenadier Regiment 474, part of the 254th Infantry Division. He died in a field hospital in Losnitzy at 4 p.m. from his wounds. He was severely wounded by shrapnel, including in the upper thighs. He is most likely buried as an unknown soldier in the Korpovo Military Cemetery. 2 other workers from the factory that served in the same regiment were Aloy Barton and Ernst Mitzdorfer. Aloy was a Gefreiter in Company 7 and was killed by a headshot in Kalalovo, Russia, on June 1, 1943. Ernst was a Gefreiter in Company 3 and died from a gunshot wound to the head in a hospital in Königsberg on October 19, 1941. Johann Peters, born on May 5, 1924 in Kellen, and fell on May 11, 1944 by Sevastopol. He was a Gefreiter and died during the Crimean Offensive of 1944. Another worker, Andreas Kuipers, would be killed fighting at Sevastopol 2 years earlier. Joseph Peters, born on November 4, 1917 in Kellen, and fell on August 4, 1944. Joseph was a Feldwebel in the 10th section of Nachtjagdgeschwader, or Night Fighter Squadron 1. At the time, the unit was in the middle of transitioning from Messerschmitt Bf-110s to Heinkel He-219s. He burned to death after his plane crashed and is buried in the military cemetery in Copenhagen West, Block A, Row 9, Grave 238. Conrad Peters, born June 10, 1914 in Cleve, and fell September 18, 1943 in the East. Conrad was a Feldwebel and was killed in the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk at Novo Ivanovsky. He is most likely buried in the unknown soldiers section of the military cemetery in Kursk. Martin Peters, born June 23, 1920 in Qualberg, and fell August 17, 1942 in Africa. Martin was an Unteroffizier in the 7th section of Kleine Kraftwagen Kolonne Betriebsstoff, or Light Motor Transport Squadron Fuel, Infantry Division Column 199. Interestingly, the 199th Infantry Division was in Narvik, not Africa, so I am unsure what division this was subordinated to. He seems to have suffered heavy burns to the soft parts of his head and face, as well as an untranslatable injury to his upper thighs, open knee joints, and open and closed leg fractures. He died in a field hospital in Derna at 5:55 p.m. Given the extent of his injuries and his service in a fuel column, it seems likely his truck was destroyed and he was injured by the explosion. Theodor Peters, born January 20th, 1902 in Cleve, and fell January 22nd, 1944 by Novgorod. Theodor was a Gefreiter and appears to have been killed shortly after the beginning of the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. Franz Pitz, born January 26, 1916 in Cleve, and fell March 22, 1945 by Hennef. He was an Obergefreiter and is buried in the Hennef-Schultzstrasse military cemetery. Wilhelm Pitz, born June 5, 1909 in Cleve, and fell November 5, 1944 in Courland. Wilhelm was an Oberfeldwebel and died in Motzalda during the fighting in the Kurland Pocket. He is most likely buried in the military cemetery in Saldus, Frauenberg, in the unknown soldiers section. Augustus Porten, born on February 18, 1909 in Cleve, and died in a hospital on April 29, 1944. Ernst Porps, born August 23, 1906 in Cleve, died in a hospital on September 22, 1941. Ernst was an Unteroffizier and is buried in the military cemetery in Lamel, Belgium, Block 61, Grave 89.